In the legends of aviation history, few names evoke as much mystery and fascination as Amelia Earhart. Famous for her daring flights and trailblazing spirit, her disappearance has captivated the world for decades. On July 2, 1937, Amelia and her navigator, Fred Noonan, vanished during their attempt to circumnavigate the globe. The last time they were ever seen was when they took off from Papua New Guinea in their Lockheed Electra for their journey across the Pacific Ocean. In the official account, it was concluded that they ran out of fuel after not being able to locate Howland Island, and perished after ditching in the Pacific. But what if that's not how it went down? What if the strong winds from the northeast, that she is known to have encountered that day, pushed her south to an uninhabited island called Gardner Island, which is now known as Nikumaroro Island, where she and Noonan landed and became castaways? But before we delve too deeply into that theory, let's talk about the events leading up to the disappearance. They were to stop at Howland Island to refuel before going on to Hawaii, and then to their finish point in Oakland, California. The Itasca, a U.S. Coast Guard cutter, was waiting off the beach at Howland Island to provide a radio beacon for Amelia to use her direction finder on the Electra to navigate to. They would have also assisted her in refueling if she had made it to Howland. A failure on the plane's antenna system prevented them from receiving signals from the Itasca, and the frequency she was using was too high for her direction finder to get a bearing on the ship. This was a detrimental factor in determining their fate. Fred Noonan's expertise was in celestial navigation, but when it came to precisely locating the Itasca and the minuscule Howland Island, they would have to rely on Amelia's radio frequency navigation. Now, let's take a flight over Howland Island in a helicopter so we can see just how small it really is. Amelia knew she was somewhere on a heading that passed over Howland Island, but she didn't know which direction on that heading line would lead her to Howland. She probably didn't realize that she was actually 150 miles south when she thought she was right over it. This is because of those strong winds that pushed her off course over the night. When they didn't see Howland while heading north on that line, they must have realized that they had a lot more options in the Phoenix Islands to the south than to the north, which is vast open ocean. This led them straight to Gardner Island. Part of the Phoenix Islands, Gardner Island had been uninhabited since 1892 when 29 islanders settled there to plant coconuts. However, they left within a year because of drought and lack of fresh water. At 4.5 miles long and 1.5 miles wide, Gardner is a coral reef on top of an extremely old volcano. It has a perimeter of land with a lagoon in the middle. The reef extends out a short distance beyond the beach underwater that is about 3 feet deep. At low tide, the water subsides, revealing a smooth, hard and flat surface that would make a good spot to land a plane. Radio communications between Amelia and the crew of the Itasca were full of static, with those on the Itasca able to hear Amelia, but she was having trouble hearing them back. The Itasca hears the last airborne radio transmission from Amelia at 8:55 a.m. Then later that night at around 6 p.m., they hear her voice but can't make out what she is saying. Amelia's static-laden and broken radio transmissions continue to be heard by the U.S. Navy, Coast Guard, Pan American Airways, and even a handful of regular citizens for the next 5 nights in a row. This supports the theory that she landed on the reef, because the only time she would be able to operate the radio on the plane would be at night when the tide went out. The 3 feet plus of water that would be present at high tide during the day would prevent her from starting the engine to run the generator to power the radio, because the prop would be partially submerged. Not to mention, the heat inside the plane while sitting in the midday sun would be unbearable. Championing the research on the Gardner Island theory is an organization called the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, or TIGER for short. TIGER documented 120 reports of radio receptions from Amelia Earhart and thoroughly investigated them. They found 57 of them to be credible, with 50 of the 57 being heard by U.S. government or commercial operators. Even some of the public on the mainland in North America heard Amelia and Noonan's pleas for help when listening on their personal shortwave radios. This was possible because the high frequency that Earhart was using created harmonics, which were able to bounce off of the ionosphere and travel very long distances, but with poor reception. One of the civilians that was able to hear Amelia on the radio was 15-year-old Betty Klink in St. Petersburg, Florida. Betty heard Amelia's frantic radio transmissions while she was searching for music on her parents' Zenith shortwave radio. When she recognized the name Earhart, she began to transcribe what she was hearing in her notebook. Betty reported also hearing a man on the transmissions. This would have been Fred Noonan. She said it sounded like they were struggling back and forth with the microphone. Apparently Noonan had a head injury because he kept complaining of his head and trying to get out of the plane because it was too hot in there, but Amelia was calling him back, trying to get him to stay in the plane. She recorded Amelia mentioning Howland Island and asking for help, then saying, "Water's high." Sadly, Betty's next transcription stated that Amelia was crying. Earhart and Noonan were likely experiencing some of the most intense moments of their lives. Betty also noted repeatedly that Amelia kept mentioning New York City. So what does New York City have to do with being stranded in the middle of the Pacific Ocean on Gardner Island? Well, nothing, unless you consider that possibly Amelia was saying something else. Something that Betty Klink got misconstrued. In 1929, a British cargo ship, the SS Norwich City, ran aground on the reef of Gardner Island after being caught up in a violent cyclone. It is believed that Amelia landed the Electra near this shipwreck. In which case, she certainly would have been saying that she landed near it on her radio transmissions. Being a documented shipwreck, it would have helped search parties locate her. It's easy to see how Betty might have thought Amelia was saying New York City when she was actually saying Norwich City, especially when we take into account that the radio transmission would have been fading in and out and full of static. Satellite images of Nikumaroro show that some wreckage of the SS Norwich City can still be seen on the reef, while most of the ship has been washed away by the dynamics of the ocean. The last transmissions that Betty received stated that the man was yelling again. He had gotten out of the plane and Amelia was getting ready to do so as well. She noted that Amelia said some cuss words and something about how the water was getting high and the plane was slipping. We are now flying over the spot where Amelia is believed to have landed in her Lockheed Electra. Only difference is it would have been low tide and not covered with water as you see here. Beyond the reef shelf, the water level drops to thousands of feet deep. In October of 1937, 3 months after Amelia and Noonan's disappearance, British Colonial Service officer Eric Bevington took a photograph of Gardner Island during a survey of the island. In 2010, a forensic imaging specialist from the team at Tiger discovered an anomaly in the photograph. The executive director of Tiger, Rick Gillespie, and imaging specialist Jeff Glickman made a super high-resolution copy of the photograph and were able to zoom in on it and determine its size by scaling it to the ship in the picture. They found it's an exact match for Lockheed Electra landing gear. The same landing gear that failed when Amelia was taking off from Honolulu on her first attempt of this flight in March of 1937. The heavily damaged airplane had to be repaired before she could try again in June. Seemingly a weak link in the design of the Electra, this adds credibility to the clue in the Bevington photo. This finding further backs up stories of Pacific Islanders that settled the island not long after Earhart's disappearance, who recalled seeing aircraft wreckage in the same location as the suspected landing gear in the photo. The location of the landing gear in the photo where the plane is believed to have landed is close to the edge of the reef. This area is where the waves crash and is very smooth and flat compared to the vicinity closer to the beach. This is probably the reason Amelia chose to land there. But also, probably the reason the plane may have gotten washed off the edge of the reef into the depths after the receding tide pulled it over the edge a little more each night. Pan Am Airways had radio transmission stations scattered around the Pacific to assist their airliners in navigating across the immense ocean. During the first 6 days after Amelia went missing, Pan Am stations on Midway, Oahu, and Wake Islands all recorded radio beam transmissions from the frequency range Earhart had been using. bearing lines from each one of these stations to the source angle all intersected at Gardner Island. Because of this, the Navy sent the battleship the USS Colorado out from Hawaii to search for the downed aircraft near Gardner. It took the Colorado a week to get to Gardner Island. By the time they arrived, the radio signals from Amelia had already stopped. This is possibly not only because she may have used up all her remaining fuel to run the radio, but because most of the plane had probably been washed over the reef edge. This is of course aside from the landing gear that was apparently torn off, as Tiger discovered in the Bevington photo. When the battleship Colorado arrived, they launched a float plane to fly over the island. There was a high tide with heavy surf, so they did not see the runway-like area that Amelia had seen, and therefore, did not think she would have been able to land there. Also notable is that the float plane flew over the island at an altitude of not less than 400 feet and for a time frame of about 10 minutes. Seems hardly a thorough search of the 7 square miles of island. It was recorded in the Colorado's logs that they saw no plane, but that they did see recent signs of habitation. They did not specify what these signs of habitation were. They must have not known that no one had inhabited Gardner since the 1800s. The only other people would have been the crew from the SS Norwich City, but they were rescued shortly after, and that was 8 years before. It's frustrating to think how close they came to finding her in Noonan, if they were still alive. In 1940, 13 bones were discovered on Gardner in a spot where there was evidence of a campsite. They were taken to Fiji and analyzed by 2 doctors. One said he thought they belonged to a European male and the other thought they came from an elderly Polynesian. They recorded measurements of the bones, but the actual bones were subsequently lost. In 2018, world-renowned forensic anthropologist and osteologist, Dr. Richard Jantz, compared the recorded bone measurements to Amelia's size and proportions. He concluded with over 99% probability that the bones fit Earhart's profile. The remnants of a shoe was also found at the campsite that was positively identified as being a woman's shoe of the popular 1930s brand Cat's Paw Bill Trite, which was made in the USA. It's the style Amelia was commonly known to have worn, and it's the style of shoes she is wearing in this picture. Several more artifacts were found at the campsite. One was an American-made jar of freckle cream ointment. Amelia was known to carry this stuff wherever she went. Having freckles and fair skin, she may have been using this as sunblock on the island. To further realize the importance of these discoveries, we must remember that the only other women to ever live on Gardner aka Nikumaroro Island were of the Pacific Islander descent, which means they didn't have freckles. If the freckle cream isn't convincing enough, they also found a woman's compact, dried makeup and mirror, which she may have been trying to use as a signaling device. Also found was an empty Benedictine liquor bottle. Amelia was known to have a supply of this liquor on the Electra because she liked it so much. The one found at the campsite had the neck broken off of it, which may have been done to make it easier to scoop up water with. Fred Noonan used an instrument called a sextant for his celestial navigation. An empty sextant box was found at the campsite which could possibly have been of a type that Noonan may have had. Expeditions to Nikumaroro by a team from Tiger found a piece of aluminum with rivet holes in it that is consistent with a piece Amelia added as a patch to cover an unneeded window on the modified Electra. They also recovered pieces of plexiglass of the type and thickness used on the plane. The folks at Tiger also discovered fish and bird bones as well as clamshells. The fish heads had not been eaten, which is further evidence that it was a Westerner. A Pacific Islander would have eaten the fish heads. Another thing they found was a jackknife that had evidence of being forcefully broken apart to extract the blade. They speculate that this was done to make a spear for fishing. With this evidence, they postulated that someone had camped there for about a week. The artifacts and evidence mostly point towards Amelia living on the island for a short time, but it is unclear what may have happened to Fred Noonan. Perhaps he succumbed to his head injury that the radio reception notes by Betty Klink seemed to suggest he had suffered. It would have been a brutally difficult survival on the island in the scorching heat with no fresh water. Giant coconut crabs are in great abundance on the island. They measure over 3 feet wide and can weigh as much as 10 pounds. They would no doubt make sleeping on the ground very difficult, if not life-threatening. It's easy to imagine Amelia not lasting very long in such a hostile environment. There is a handful of other theories about what happened to Amelia Earhart. The Gardner hypothesis is one that in my opinion seems very likely. If we still had the bones, and DNA testing showed it to be her, it would be case solved. Even if those bones turned out not to be Amelia, it's still very plausible that she ended up on Gardner, given the abundance of physical evidence as well as the radio transmissions, that all work synergistically to imply that she was there. Amelia Earhart lived an adventurous life, conquering her many achievements. She was then, and is now, not just an inspiration for women around the world, but an inspiration for everyone. Inspiration for the human spirit of not being afraid to go out into the world and enjoy your life and do the things you really want to do. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe.